The HOA had always been a festering blight on our quiet neighborhood, a petty dictatorship masquerading as a guardian of order. I'd seen it from the moment I moved, in the snide letters, the endless complaints, the way they wielded their clipboard, authority like a scepter over the lives of decent people. But I'd chosen to ignore it, to let their nonsense wash over me like rain on stone. I wasn't afraid, far from it. I stayed out of their crosshairs because I knew if they ever came for me, they'd ignite a fire they couldn't extinguish. I'm a federal judge, a man forged in the crucible of law, and I don't bend to fools. Then one day, they didn't just cross the line, they obliterated it. I came home to find my trees, my sacred grove, butchered beyond recognition. No warning, no permission, no mercy, just devastation. I'll never forget that moment. The sun was dipping below the horizon as I turned onto my street, my mind still tangled in the day's courtroom battles. I'd been anticipating the quiet solace of my home, the familiar embrace of those towering oaks and maples that had stood guard over my property for decades, planted by hands long turned to dust, nurtured by generations who understood the sanctity of the earth. They weren't just trees. They were history, a living testament to time, their branches weaving a canopy of shade, beauty, and privacy that made my house a refuge from the world. I'd bought this place for them, paid cash outright, no loans, no permits, no HOA shekels, because I wanted something pure, untouchable. I'd told that woman, the HOA president, from day one, stay off my land. I never signed their contract, never bowed to their absurd rules. But she couldn't leave well enough alone. As I pulled into the driveway, my heart stopped. The air felt wrong, too thin, too raw. The green wall that had always greeted me was gone. Where my trees once stood, there was nothing but a wasteland of stumps, jagged and broken. Scattered across the yard like the aftermath of a massacre, the smell hit me next, freshly cut wood, sharp and bitter. A scent that should have been comforting, but instead twisted my gut into knots. I stepped out of the car, legs unsteady, and stared. My yard, once a lush sanctuary, now looked like a battlefield, the earth scarred and exposed, the stumps rising like tombstones of something irreplaceable. Shock gripped me first, a hollow disbelief that this could be real. Who would dare? Who would have the audacity to invade my property and annihilate something so precious? Then I saw a pickup truck parked brazenly on the street, the HOA logo plastered across its side like a declaration of war. And there she was, stepping out with a smile that made my blood boil. She was everything I despised, arrogant, petty, a self-appointed queen drunk on the illusion of power. Her name was Evelyn Hart, though I'd never bothered to learn it until that moment. She'd just been the HOA woman, a nuisance I'd dismissed. She strode toward me, hands clasped in front of her, that smug little grin stretching her lips as if she'd won some grand victory. "Oh, I'm so glad you're here," she said, her voice dripping with crocodile tears. "We were just adjusting the community's aesthetics. Your trees didn't meet HOA standards." Standards? She'd razed my property, torn out its soul, and she stood there prattling about standards. I felt something snap inside me, not the hot, reckless anger of youth, but a cold, precise fury that sank into my bones like frost. It wasn't just an attack on my land. It was personal, a calculated strike meant to break me. She didn't know who I was. She didn't know the hell she'd just unleashed. Asterisk, I'd always kept the HOA at arm's length. I'd seen the neighbors, grievance-sized fines for a mailbox an inch too tall. The lectures over unmowed grass, the way Evelyn strutted through the streets like she owned every blade of it. I'd heard the whispers of her little reign of terror, the way she'd browbeat people into submission with her rules, and her sanctimonious speeches about community harmony. I'd stayed out of it, not because I feared her God, no, but because I knew if she ever turned her sights on me, she'd be stepping into a fight she couldn't win. I'm not a man who wastes energy on petty squabbles. I save my strength for battles that matter. But she'd been testing me from the start. First came the polite letters, all saccharine and veiled, suggesting I trim my trees to fit her sterile vision. Then the violation notices, each one more absurd than the last, claiming my oaks clashed with her perfect neighborhood. I tossed them all into the trash, where they belonged. She must have taken my silence for weakness. She was about to learn how wrong she was. That day, standing in the wreckage of my yard, I didn't scream. I didn't charge at her, fists swinging, though every muscle in my body begged for it. Instead, I took a deep breath, counting to 10 in my head, letting the rage settle into something sharper, something lethal. She wanted a reaction, a scene she could twist to paint me as the villain. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction. I turned to her, my voice calm but edged with steel. Let me get this straight. You trespassed onto my property without permission and destroyed my trees because you didn't like how they looked. She blinked, caught off guard by my restraint, but she rallied quickly, that grin flickering back to life. Not quite, she said, folding her arms. The HOA has authority over the neighborhood's aesthetics. Your trees were out of line with the established standard. It's all for harmony. Harmony. That word, her flimsy banner for control, lit a match in my chest. I stepped closer, locking eyes with her. Good. Then you won't mind me taking this to court. Her laugh was sharp, nervous, a crack in her facade. Court, she said, voice pitching higher. There's no need to escalate. This was a simple HOA decision, well within our rights. I smiled then, a thin, dangerous curve, and leaned in just enough to make her flinch. I'm a federal judge. The words landed like a guillotine. Her face drained of color, her smugness evaporating as if I'd doused it in acid. Her hands fell limp at her sides, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. What? She whispered, barely audible. You committed trespass, I continued, voice low and unrelenting. You damaged private property without authorization. This isn't an HOA misstep, it's a crime. She had no response, no defense, just the dawning terror of a woman who'd stepped on a landmine and heard the click. I turned and walked back to my house, leaving her stranded in the wreckage of her own making. Inside, I felt a different kind of energy, not the blind rage of the moment, but a cold, meticulous thrill, the kind that comes when you know you've already won. She thought she ruled this neighborhood, that her little fiefdom was untouchable. She didn't realize she'd just killed a fight with the one person who could dismantle her world without breaking a sweat. I sat at my desk, the adrenaline pulsing through me like a war drum, and began to plan. First, evidence. My security cameras had caught everything: the trucks rolling in, the chainsaws roaring, the deliberate destruction of my trees. The footage was damning, a reel of her guilt in high definition. But I didn't stop there. As a federal judge, I knew where to look for the cracks in her armor, and I found them in spades. Public records confirmed what I'd suspected. My property wasn't under HOA jurisdiction. I'd bought it free and clear, outside their reach. They had no legal standing to touch a single leaf, let alone raise my yard. Trespass was just the beginning. Cutting those trees, some over 50 years old, violated state environmental laws. Fines could climb into the tens of thousands, maybe more, depending on the damage assessment. I could have stopped there, let the law bury them in penalties, but I wanted more. I dug into the HOA's financials, expecting petty mismanagement. What I found was a gold mine of corruption. Huge payments to non-existent landscaping firms, transfers to personal accounts, fees hiked year after year with no explanation, millions siphoned away, all signed off by Evelyn Hart. She wasn't just a tyrant, she was a thief, bleeding the neighborhood dry while preaching her gospel of harmony. For days, I waited, letting her stew in her own panic. She didn't dare show her face, but a letter arrived, pathetic, groveling, claiming the trees were a safety hazard, insisting it was all a misunderstanding. The kicker, a warning that I'd be fined if I replanted without HOA approval. I laughed, a dark, bitter sound, and tucked it away for the courtroom. Then I turned to the neighbors, the ones she'd tormented for years. I invited them over, laid out the evidence, the fraud, the theft, the illegal tree cutting. Their jaws dropped, eyes widening as the truth sank in. That's why they never fix anything. One man shouted, voice cracking with years of frustration. She's been stealing from us. A woman cried, tears of rage streaking her face. The spark caught and the fire spread. I watched her empire crumble. Neighbors confronted her, demanded answers she couldn't give. She hid, a queen dethroned, while I prepared the killing blow. I filed a complaint with the city environmental violations for the trees. Inspectors descended, their reports a noose tightening around the HOA's neck. Fines mounted, a financial reckoning she couldn't escape. Then I sent the financial evidence to the state auditors, each document a dagger aimed at her heart. The investigation erupted like a volcano, scorching everything in its path. But the true climax came at the HOA's desperate final meeting. The room was a powder keg resonance, packed shoulder to shoulder, their anger a living thing. Evelyn stood at the front, pale and trembling, trying to salvage her reign with excuses about mismanaged funds and operational challenges. It was pitiful, a drowning woman clutching at straws. When she dared mention the trees, I stood, and the room fell silent, every eye on me. Let's talk, I said, slamming her financial records onto the table. Money vanishing into your accounts. Fake companies. Theft all. Signed by you. The crowd gasped, a collective inhale of fury. I held up the city's report. And illegal tree removal fines, you'll never pay off. The room exploded shouts, curses, demands for justice. Her phone rang, mid-chaos. She answered, and her face collapsed. The government had frozen the HOA's funds. A lawsuit was filed. She was finished. Weeks later, the HOA was dissolved. A new council rose, and Evelyn fled house sold, rumors whispering she'd vanished across the country to escape her shame. I stayed, my yard still scarred but my spirit unbroken. Where trees once stood, I'd planted something greater, justice, and it thrived. Don't forget to leave your like and comment.